Okay, good morning once again. For those of you, a couple of you who may not know me, I'm Pastor Dan Peterson of Queen Anne Lutheran Church, and this is the first of a three-session series on almost banned from the Bible, and we're going to be looking at the book of Esther. Esther was not the only book in the Bible that was almost banned, and so depending on how this conversation goes, we might pick up the series again in the coming year or years, looking at, for example, the Song of Songs, which also was almost banned, as well as the book of Ecclesiastes. In the New Testament, the book that was almost banned was perhaps surprisingly, maybe you can guess, the book of Revelation. As well as the letter to the Hebrews. So we have at least 5 or 6 contenders for what could be a couple-year run on a topic that fascinates me and I hope will intrigue you as well. Just a note for those who arrived within the last couple of minutes, we are recording this session today and we'll post it on our webpage. That's queenannelutheran.org. So if you want to review any of the material, you're welcome to do so there. I am looking at Esther as part of a larger project that involves, among others, the Song of Songs, and that really is interested in a theological question. But the theological question is something I'm going to bracket and set aside until next week. Today, what we're going to do is look at the story itself. Now, I know at least a few of you were part of a Bible study about a year ago on the book of Esther. And so there will be a point in our conversation where I will rely on you to help us reconstruct the narrative. But that's going to be our first of 3 foci today. Number 1, reconstructing the narrative so that everybody's on the same page regarding the plot of the story itself. 2, we'll do this next week, identifying reasons for why it was almost banned, as well as noting again the Song of Songs and Ecclesiastes, which likewise almost suffered the same fate. And then for the final part of the series, we're going to rehabilitate Esther and Esther's status by showing, once we decode it, why it not only deserves its place in the Bible, but I'm going to argue that Esther is the queen of the Bible, as well as the queen at the time of Persia. So we have a lot to cover in the next 3 weeks, and I'm really excited. In all 3 sessions, you are welcome to ask clarifying questions as we go. I'll try to save time, particularly at the end of next session and the session that follows, for bigger questions at the end. So as we go, please feel free to ask clarifying questions. Finally, the goal is that by the end of this series, you will have tools for uncovering, and I'm really excited about this. Number 1, the secrets of Scripture, and I will show you that there are secrets in this book that can be uncovered if you have the right tools. My second goal is to show you why Esther remains relevant, particularly today. And then finally, I simply want to invite you to get excited with me about the Bible itself. So are you ready?
Yes.
Thumbs up. Okay, here we go. Today, as I said, we're going to reconstruct the story by paying attention to 5 basic elements of plot. So we're looking at the book of Esther in terms of these 5 basic elements. Now, you'll notice the artwork here. I'll be featuring a couple different portraits of Esther. What's fascinating, and you may want to do this if you go online really quick, is to do a Google image search on the book of Esther and to see how she has been portrayed. The text itself says that she was beautiful, so beautiful that she would ultimately win the hand of marriage from the king. But many of the portraits, of course, reflect her in European categories. You might, though, want to go and look at some of the other portraits as well. But this is one of those more European presentations of Esther. And there's another work of art that I'll show you from the 17th or 18th century later in the class today that looks at something about Esther that I think reflects a particularly male bias. So we'll come back to that as well. All right, so 5 basic elements of plot and ultimately what's missing when we look at Esther. All right, that worked. By the way, did you notice the fade there? That was pretty great, huh? This is a big step. one small step for Dan, one giant leap for Queen Anne Lutheran Church. So we've got the 5 elements of plot. So here's the idea. Any story has these particular basic elements of plot in the narrative arc. That is the chain of events that occur in the story. So whether you're writing a story or reading a story, these are sort of the 5 basic ingredients of the recipe. And the first of them is exposition. So the exposition is a story, is the book or story's introduction where characters are introduced, the setting is established, the author begins to introduce conflict. Essentially, this is background. And in a book, it typically takes up several chapters. In the story of Esther, it also takes up the first 1 or 2 chapters as well. So you have exposition, which is the story's introduction or background that provides the context for the subsequent events of the narrative to unfold. I like to think of it this way, and I'll go back to Todd on this one more time. As a journalist, what you're looking for here, Todd is a former journalist of the PI and now of GeekWire. As a journalist here, you'd be looking for the who, what, when, where. And we're going to look at that momentarily as well. So exposition is the first part of the plot. And in the book of Esther, it takes up the first roughly 1 to 2 chapters out of a 10-chapter narrative. The story, by the way, was expanded after it was originally written. We'll talk about that next week. It was expanded from 10 to 14 chapters in the Greek translation, which you can still find in some Catholic Bibles. All right, the next element of plot is rising action. So rising action, as you might guess, usually involves what's called an inciting incident. That is, it introduces conflict in the story and then adds additional moments of escalation or conflict. So the rising action is basically the problem that the characters, or at least the protagonist, is going to encounter. And what happens here is, after an inciting incident, additional measures of conflict are used as well to build up. I like to think of this as, I don't know how many of you did this, maybe raise your hand. You've certainly all been on roller coasters. I remember the log ride at Knott's Berry Farm in California. But it's where you get just to the top of the roller coaster, right? So the whole point of the narrative is to kind of raise things up, create tension and conflict, so that you can get to the third part, which is the climax or peak of the story. So the peak itself is going to have particular qualities, and one of those is a significant change of heart on the part of a main character. So I was thinking here of contemporary examples, perhaps in episode 3 of Star Wars, where Anakin turns to the dark side. The whole purpose of that otherwise rather poor quality film is to build things up to a peak. And in this case, it would have been Anakin Skywalker's turn to the dark side. So the climax is that peak moment where something happens. In the case of Anakin Skywalker, something bad. In the case of our story, as you'll see, or as you may recall, something quite good. We'll come back to that, of course, as well as all of these. I have a quote to share with you there. Now, the fourth point of fourth element of a plot is called falling action. And this is where, after the peak has been reached, the narrative moves toward resolution. It starts resolving conflicts, particularly at the level of subplots. So we'll see that in Esther as well, that certain conflicts beneath the main narrative are increasingly resolved. And then finally, of course, you have fifth and finally the resolution itself, which is the end of the story where you tie up loose ends. And here, again, you'll have to forgive me. This works really well with confirmation students. I was thinking of Return of the Jedi, after Luke has his battle with Darth Vader and then destroys, the Death Star is destroyed. The resolution would be the celebrations that follow, the almost tying of the knot with Han Solo and Princess Leia, etc. So these are the 5 elements of the plot. I want to stop there and see if there are any questions. Let me see here. So does that appear on your screen as well, what I'm doing right now, where it shows each of you? Okay, so I'm just doing that so I can see if there are any questions. Okay, Jennifer, so far so good. Any other questions for clarification? Now, this isn't really the meat of what we're going to talk about today, but my feeling is that if you have a sense of these 5 basic elements of plot, you're going to be able better to make sense and of the book of Esther in particular, which rather well actually follows these 5 basic elements. All right. Now, before we turn to the first of these categories, I want to turn it over to you and ask you, tell me what you know about the book of Esther. Okay, tell me what, let's see. Yeah. I know several of you read it somewhat recently. So, okay, Nancy is one. Nancy, I'm going to pick on you just because you bravely gave the thumbs up there. What's something you recall about Esther?
Last time I do that, no. Well, I find the story, as you pointed out, the plot, the story of Esther to be very interesting. As you know, looking at this young woman at the time who was a hidden Jew. I call her hidden because she was told not to tell anyone. So she's living with this secret, and this very beautiful young girl, really, I mean, she's just a girl, I think.
Yeah.
Who draws the attention, I'd say more than attention, the love of this king of Persia, who falls in love with her, and he's just cast aside the other wife, Yep. She's out. As a woman, I don't like that part.
We're going to talk about that. Yeah, that's
I don't like that part, Pastor. Anyway. Yeah.
We're not going to condone that here. Don't worry.
But anyway, going back to Esther, as this hidden Jew, and then the king is obviously just so taken with her. I think it's a love story.
It is, in some ways.
I think he genuinely loves her. And so when her people are threatened, when there's there's a man in the court, I can't remember all the names, but who wants to kill all the Jews because of this political thing going on. He wants to get rid of them. And so she goes to the king under the instructions of her uncle, I guess.
Her cousin, Mordecai, who is older. Yes.
Yes, who also raised her.
That's correct.
Because she was an orphan. Also, this young girl. I was thinking of the pressure on her, I mean, it must have been tremendous. Anyway, so she goes to the king and asks him, persuades him to allow the Jews to live.
And let me stop you there, because you've taken us really to the climax of the story already, and it's wonderful.
To tell the story.
What do you know about it? But this is wonderful because you're giving us, like I said, the narrative arc itself, which is perfect. And so what I want to do, and what my job will be to do in the next couple of minutes, is to help start filling in some of those gaps. But in terms of a lay of the land, you've really carved that out well. So I want everybody to kind of note this, and it'll be really helpful. What Nancy has done here is kind of given us the bird's eye macro view, and that's going to be important as we go through and look at the details of the story. So that's really the first half of the story, which is great. Is there anybody who would like to fill in any details or other things they know about Esther with regard to the first half of the story? Anything else? Jackie, I saw that you bravely raised your hand. Is there something you'd like to add?
You're testing my memory. I just read it last night, and I didn't find it so much of a love story, but ask me that question again.
Well, it's what do you know about Esther? So what are maybe a couple things that stand out either in Nancy's summary or what you read directly yesterday? What stood out?
I can't. Her beauty and her and Mordecai's use of her.
Yeah. Yeah, so Mordecai plays a really important role here. However, as feminist scholars have pointed out in the last few decades, Mordecai has often been painted, thanks to patriarchal tradition, as quote unquote, the real hero of the story, when in fact it was never Mordecai, as we'll see, who put his life on the line to save his people. Having said that, he does play an important role. And because of that, we'll need to consider exactly the role that he plays. In particular, it's going to be Mordecai, short of those bigger political reasons, but Mordecai simply for the fact that he doesn't do a particular gesture that will incite Haman, who is the antagonist of the story, to vow vengeance, not only on him, but on all his people. So Mordecai is pretty important. Yeah. And I would agree here with you, Jackie. I don't read it as much as a love story. What I read it more, although there may be, we could probably tease a few of those elements out. I'm not closed to that reading, but I really think that what the story is about is more the perseverance and ingenuity of a people who are living in a foreign land to survive. In fact, the text at one point has one of the characters say that that the Jews are indestructible, and we'll come to that. It's a fascinating moment in the narrative. Jackie, please.
The other Jackie. Hi, Jackie. Just this is a bit of an aside, but I remember when Bess Meyerson was the first Jewish Miss America. And I mean, I think, Esther is somebody who was kind of young, beautiful, and kind of going along her life, and then got set in a circumstance where her Jewishness called her to act in certain ways.
Yeah, that's a fascinating parallel. I didn't know about that. I think it makes a lot of sense there. And I'd like to encourage that. So as we continue, I'd love to note other parallels like that. In the case of Esther, Jackie's absolutely correct. She was just kind of going along with. We don't have any evidence that she was practicing her faith before the events that transpired took place. All we know is that she was ethnically Jewish. That's it. And that as Mordecai instructed, she concealed her identity until it was almost too late. All right, I want to look at the second half of the story, but what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to hold off on that for now. And then Nancy, I'd love to get your help again. When we get to the second half of the story, I'd love you, if you can, to help us kind of give the macro view of that half as well, okay? So we'll come back to that in a little while. Let's start first by looking more in depth at the element of exposition that we see at the beginning of the story. So exposition, you'll recall, we have who, which would refer to the characters, what, the event or events that occur, time or when, time, obviously when it takes place, and finally where it takes place. And so let's look at the characters first. Who would you say are the main characters? We've already talked about a couple of them. We have Mordecai, who is Esther's elder cousin, who is important for a number of reasons. Who else do we have? We have Queen Esther herself, obviously, who's pictured here. We also have the antagonist. He is the king's highest official, and his name again is
Haman.
Haman or Haman. I don't know how to pronounce his name, but even more difficult to pronounce. What's that?
Haman. So Haman.
Okay, perfect. So Haman, And then, of course, the character whose name, if you can pronounce the character's name, you've pretty much got it good. The rest of the story doesn't even matter if you can get this guy's name right. What is it?
King.
The king. Well, I cheat a little bit. His Persian name is Xerxes I. And we have archaeological evidence as well as historical evidence that he was in fact a king of Persia of the 5th century, who ruled from about 486 to 465 BC. So that's King Xerxes I. His name in the story in Hebrew is Ahasuerus. That's one of two ways we pronounce it in English. Ahasuerus, I think of Lazarus, Ahasuerus, or Ahasuerus, Ahasuerus. So if you can get either of those by the end of the series, my work here is basically done. Everything else will be footnotes. But Ahasuerus, I think, is the easier of the two. So we'll go with Ahasuerus. The story tells us during the exposition right away that he rules over 127 provinces from India to Nubia, or India to Ethiopia. And right away, that number is pretty significant. Herodotus, a Greek historian, tells us that Xerxes I had a much more modest 20 provinces. So the author is already doing something in the text here that will be noteworthy later on. 127 provinces. He is inordinately wealthy and lives in the capital city of Susa, which takes us to where, namely Persia, which is modern day Iraq. So 127 provinces, a vast range of territory, and inordinate wealth. All right, that's the exposition. We also have, among others in the exposition, Queen Vashti. Vashti is the queen until an event occurs right at the beginning of the story. Xerxes holds two banquets, the first of which is for 180 days. In the language itself, the word for banquets here could be literally translated drink fests. So he holds two drink fests for a whopping, the first of which is a whopping 180 days. That's remarkable, even for the modern day college student. So you have these lavish banquets, these long banquets, and it's at the second one that Vashti is invited to do something. Does anybody who read the story recall what that is?
Come nude to the banquet.
She's what? Say that again?
Well, I'll say it.
Go.
The king wants her to appear at the banquet, and the banquet is only for men. It is not for women, and she refuses to come.
She refuses to come for possibly that reason and another reason that's equally disturbing. What does the king ask her to do?
Well, he
wants her
answered
to
it.
show how beautiful she is.
Yeah, so he asks her to show everybody how beautiful she is by unveiling herself. And what Vashti recognizes, at least according to a variety of modern day commentators, is that the king is basically inviting her to publicly humiliate herself by objectifying herself before others. And she does something here that is rather remarkable, so much so that modern feminist scholars are arguing it's one indication that this story was written by women and not by men. And what she does is she refuses. And for me, I think this is really one of the points of the narrative that needs to be lifted up. There are some folks on the more conservative side of the spectrum who are going to ignore this. But I think, especially coming from a more progressive perspective, that we really need to lift this up. Vashti goes against the conventions of her time. And for that reason, after she denies the king, she's deposed by the king. And so the king, after deposing her, asks his commissioners to go out into Persia and seek the most beautiful women of Persia to become part of his harem. And based upon that, will decide who is to be the next queen of Persia. And out of that process, Esther emerges victoriously. What can you tell me about Esther from the first few? Yeah, Nancy, please.
Yeah, just from what you've just said, it occurs to me that this is really about women of courage. You know, the prior, sorry, I can't say all the names and I haven't practiced them, but anyway, the former queen and how she stands up. I mean, in that time, think of it, women had no rights. And
Absolutely.
she stood up for herself. So it's about a courageous act on her part. And then she gives everything up. She's out. She's gone.
Right, and I think that's a great point to hold up. That this is about Vashti's courage in the face of patriarchal conventions, and the consequences that occur when one defies those conventions. So she's out, and then we see this again in Esther. I think you have two grand acts of courage in this story, and they're both performed by women. Vashti first, and Esther second.
Yeah,
So let's talk a little bit about Esther then herself. What else can you tell me about her briefly, based on what you know?
Well, I think she was caught in the middle of a political dilemma, the fight between the Jews and the non-Jews. And in a way she was a pawn, but she stood up to try to save her people.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
I guess I would just comment, I know people are saying that they don't think it's a love story. I think that the reason the king saved the Jews was because he loved Esther.
Yeah.
I don't think he was he didn't care that much about the Jews from anything I read.
Yeah, he's basically indifferent.
But he loved Esther. And when she went to him and asked him for help, because he loved her, that's, I think, what saved them.
I think that's a plausible reading. Absolutely. I don't emphasize it in my own reading, but I think you could argue it's there. Absolutely. I mean, if it wasn't for at least his affection for Esther, they very likely would have not been saved by the king in terms of the Jews as such. So I think it's a plausible reading, definitely. All right, let's talk a little bit about Esther herself. She's identified as beautiful. She becomes part of the king's harem in the exposition. And then finally, she is ultimately made queen, where in the process, she's concealed her identity as Jewish. Now, it's at this point in the story that Martin Luther makes a comment. Luther wrote a commentary on Esther. And what he says about Esther here is that this is an example of, I love it, pagan naughtiness. And for this reason, as well as several others, Luther says that he wishes the book of Esther was never included in the Bible. Now, how on earth is this an example of pagan naughtiness? Well, it's an example of pagan naughtiness because Esther belongs to a harem outside of marriage. And so for Luther, that's too much. I don't know why he would select this moment in the Old Testament to make that point, but that is among, I believe, several reasons for why he does not care for this book. But Esther becomes the eventual queen. It's set up in the exposition, and then later, of course, she will make a decision that will affect her as well as all of her people. I want to say just a few quick words about Mordecai and Haman. Mordecai is important because he helps us set the time in which the story is set to occur. So he and Ahasuerus give us clues. Xerxes I, we know from outside of the story, was the grandson of a famous Persian ruler. Can you guess who this Persian ruler was? He's mentioned in the book of Isaiah and is often by evangelicals compared to Donald Trump today. Cyrus the Great. So who was Cyrus the Great? Why was he significant? Cyrus liberated the Jews who had been held captive in Babylon for 50 years. He liberated them in 536 and allowed them to return to their homeland. Some of them, however, decided to stay and remain in Persian territories. And among those, we have Mordecai's great grandfather, who's mentioned in Esther 2. I think it's Kish is his name. So Mordecai is the direct descendant, along with Esther, of an exile. This exile decided to stay in Persia and becomes part of what's called the greater diaspora or dispersion of the Jews. That's how Mordecai ties into the story. He's the great-grandson of an exile who raised Esther, who was his cousin, who the story simply says had neither father nor mother. So he basically raises the orphan Esther in his own house. And then finally, Haman, who is the king's highest official and a major part of the story, he's promoted. He takes taking credit for something that Mordecai found out about the king. So now we've established the exposition. We know who the main characters are. We know when this occurs, 486 to 465, at least that's when it's set. We know where it occurs, Persia, which is modern-day Iraq, and as part of a much broader empire of 127 provinces. And we know finally what's occurring. We have 2 banquets that have resulted in a new queen. All right, let's move next to the second element of plot, and that is rising action. So I want to say just a few words about this, rising action. You have 2 incidences that occur here. The first is Esther 3, verses 1 through 6. And for reasons of time, I'm going to just summarize that for you. It's here that Mordecai, who'd been sitting at the gates of the palace, discovers something you might say in the whispers. He discovers that there is a plot to assassinate the king. And so he tells Esther, who tells the king, effectively saving the king's life. Haman, however, is the one who receives credit for it. Haman is elevated to the king's highest official, even though it was Mordecai who actually discovered the plot and told Esther. When Haman is leaving the palace courts, he passes Mordecai on his way out, and Mordecai refuses to do something that infuriates Haman. Can you guess what it is? I'll give you a hint. This guy has a very fragile ego. He refuses to do something.
To bow down to him.
Bow, exactly. He refuses to bow. And when Haman's officials ask why, Mordecai simply says, because I'm a Jew. So because he's a Jew, he refuses to bow to Haman. And Haman, as a result, is infuriated. And he pledges not only to take Mordecai's life, but also vows revenge, get this, on all the Jews of Persia, all 127 provinces. Now, this is why I'm going to point out as we go that the story takes on a particularly eerie relevance post-mid-20th century in our world. This is the first time in history that a genocide is going to be attempted on the Jews. And its reasoning is so bizarre. It's simply because Mordecai refused to bow in Haman's presence. So that particular moment is what we would call the inciting incident in the plot. And from there, the tension is escalated. In Esther 4:1 through 3, we have Mordecai doing what after he's found out what's going to happen to his people. So one little point there, Haman takes this back to the king and says to the king that the Jews refuse to obey his laws, and Haman then requests to execute all the Jews, and the king, who is indifferent and who still doesn't know that Esther is one of them, agrees. And so these decrees are sent out by Haman to destroy all the Jews on a particular day of the calendar. And that's where we get the word for the festival of Purim. That's P-U-R-I-M in the Jewish tradition. This is the day that Haman casts lots, or pur in the original language, which is like drawing straws. So he draws straws to see when the Jews will be executed. And that gives us the name of the event of Purim, which Jews celebrate up to this day. In fact, it's the only commandment of its kind in the entire Hebrew Bible. It stipulates that on 2 days of the year, when the Jews reversed Haman's plot, they are to celebrate. and party it up. So what this story does is gives us an account of the origin of the festival, which some scholars believe was a Babylonian festival appropriated by the Jews. And evidence they give for that is the very fact that its two main characters, Esther and Mordecai, are Hebrew versions of Babylonian names. Esther is Ishtar, a Babylonian god, and Mordecai is Marduk, another Babylonian god. So some scholars argue that this is a Babylonian festival appropriated by the Jews, and that this story was written later to account for the origin of this festival. Pretty fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
All right, so we have the rising action, and then we get to the third part of the plot, and that's going to be the peak. And this is really crucial. What I want to do is, show you how Esther's decision functions as the peak of the story. So here we have it on screen. The climax is the peak of tension, plot, and character in the story. It's the moment that the reader has been waiting for. Often this is the point in the story that everything changes, or where the main character is forced to make a life-altering decision. So you can probably guess what that decision is. In fact, let me ask you to guess. What's the decision that's being made here? Someone who hasn't shared yet, if you know the story. Well, let's take a look at it then. This is from Esther 4:13 to 16. Mordecai has been talking with Esther about the situation before them. He has fasted, which is an important moment in the plot. It occurs, previous slide, chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. We'll come back to that later. Mordecai has fasted. He is mourned what's going to happen, and he pleads to messengers of Esther to have her intervene. But Esther is very reluctant to do this. For one thing, the king still doesn't know that she's Jewish. And for another king, the only way that the king can grant you an audience is if he raises his scepter when you walk into his court. And if he doesn't, you are to be killed. So if Esther if Esther goes into his court and the king does not raise his scepter, she will be killed. And so for that reason, quite understandably, she is very hesitant to say anything. And this is Mordecai's reply through her messengers. I would also argue this is the crux of the story. Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter, but you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this." Then Esther said in reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf." It's very important. "And neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will also fast as you do. After that, I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." Wow. What an incredible moment in this story. What a great peak or climax to the story. You can see here that Esther makes a life-changing decision. There are some scholars more on the Christian side than the Jewish, I think, but I'm persuaded that this is plausible here, who talk about this as Esther's conversion, where instead of focusing exclusively on herself, she focuses on the fate of the rest of her people, even when it could mean her life. So I see a few smiles there. That makes me think that others may have thought about this as well. It's such a remarkable moment in the narrative when Esther makes this decision. And then what we have after the climax of the story here in chapter 4 is it kind of just rolls naturally. We have the by the way, and this is for Todd and everybody else who are into technology. See what I did here? I've got moving parts to the images. This is a big day for me. So falling action. After this occurs, she appears before the king. And it's here that I guess I want to bring Nancy back in, if you're comfortable with this, Nancy. and helping me give that macro view of this second half of the story. What can you share here that might help us?
Well, I'm reminded how young Esther is. She's probably just a girl. Well,
Yeah.
maybe a teenage girl.
Yeah, probably.
And think of the position she's put in. You know, her people could all be killed, and it's all supposed to be on her to talk to the king, and she's afraid for her own life.
Exactly.
I think she has great courage. She goes to the king. He allows her to come, and so she asks him for, to grant her people, what do you call, I don't know the word.
Pardon or?
A pardon, I guess.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Anyway, because the king has already given the order. That's part of the problem, politically. He's in a dilemma because he's already given the order to kill all the Jews. So
right.
how does he reverse that? That's a difficult position for him to be in, but this is where I think it's a love story.
Yeah.
Because I think the only reason that he then reverses his order and has, Haman is arrested, executed, as you've got, I'm just following your words here, Pastor, is because he loves Esther.
Right. Right. And so, yeah, so that's certainly, like I said before, that's very plausible. And so what we have is, because of his love or affection for Esther, she's allowed to appear before him in the court. The king, the night before or the night after, can't sleep. This is another important moment in the plot. And so he does what anybody does when they can't sleep without television or the internet. He asks the court to give him the records of his court, that basically the news of the past few days for him. And as he's reading through, he discovers that a certain man named Mordecai was responsible for ultimately for alerting the king to his potential assassination, not Haman. And so what you can see here is these conflicts start to resolve. The king discovers who discovered the plot, Mordecai, and Esther not only asks for her people to be pardoned, but he asks to give her people permission to enact vengeance on all of their enemies. And so there's a complete reversal here. And what you start to see are these reversals. So Haman is brought in. The king reverses his decision about Haman's status. And because of all this, he has Haman executed on the very instrument that Haman had built to execute Mordecai, which is it's 50 cubits it's 50 cubits of height, this gallows, which again, I want you to think about how this starts to stack up. 127 provinces, you have banquets that last for 180 days. And now here you have an instrument of execution that is some 50 cubits high, which in our equivalents is about 75 feet. And so Haman is executed on a gallows that is 75 feet high, and then eventually his 10 sons are executed as well. It gets pretty brutal here, and this is where both Jews and Christians really want to hit the brakes historically and say, this is really unbecoming as a story in the Bible. And so exactly, Jennifer, and what you see there is there are moments in the last part of these chapters, or in the last part of the story, where the Jews relentlessly cut down their adversaries, and they leave nothing except they don't plunder, but they destroy indiscriminately men, women, and children. And for this reason, there was not a single Christian commentary written on Esther for the first 7 centuries of the Common Era. And not only that, it's never quoted once by any author of the 27 books of the New Testament. So there were issues here. We also know, for a reason I'll share with you next week, that when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947, every single scroll of the Bible was found except Esther. For some reason, the Essenes, a monastic community that lived apart from the rest of the Jews in the desert, for some reason, the Essenes themselves didn't want this book as part of their canon. So there is this this moment where there's just this bloody revenge. And as I put about it in one of my writings now, this is where the children of Abraham beat their plowshares back into swords and relentlessly and ruthlessly cut down all their adversaries. But what that does is it resolves these conflicts in the plot. These 2 days are the days that the Jews essentially enact their survival. And that becomes really the last part of the this fourth element of the plot. Let me move us back here. Esther's granted an audience. The king's insomnia leads to an important discovery. Haman executed, and the plot is reversed. Let's take a look now at the next slide. Resolution. Now, in the resolution, you'll recall we talked about how the author will tie up loose ends. In this case, you have the affirmation of victory, whereby the victory is affirmed. And I want to introduce this to you. We're going to talk about it next week. There are 2 moments here where the victory is articulated in the passive voice. For example, it says that this was the day that had been turned for the Jews. We don't know who the subject of the turning is here. And there are 2 moments like that in this resolution. An affirmation of their victory in the passive voice, the explanation of Purim, which I gave earlier, as a celebration of this reversal that occurs, and the establishment of the Purim holiday, where again we have the only commandment of its kind in Scripture. And incidentally, let's see how much time we have here. We have 10 minutes. There was a medieval Jewish scholar by the name of Moses Maimonides. And Maimonides is considered to be arguably the greatest Jewish philosopher of the Middle Ages, as well as a very famous Torah scholar and pre-Copernican astronomer, as well as physician. So before the Renaissance occurred, he was a Renaissance man. And what Maimonides says is that only the Torah and the book of Esther will survive the transition from this age to the Messianic age. And it's because Esther contains this commandment in chapter 9:28, where the Jews are told they must celebrate every year. And since this commandment is in keeping with the mood of the Messianic age, where there will be endless celebration and festivity, Esther will weather the transition, which I think is so fascinating. He said the rest of the Hebrew Bible, including all the prophets, will dissolve away. And the reason he says that is that these books recount the suffering of the Jews and their ancestors. And so there will be no memory of suffering in the coming age. Only Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, and Esther will be preserved. I love that. What Maimonides has done here, by the way, is buck about 1,200 years or more of negative interpretation of Esther for reasons I've already cited. I think that's fascinating. But here's what's even more fascinating, and then we'll close and open it up to questions. The authorship of Esther. Verse 29 includes the queen herself as one of the writers. And this is what I want to show you here. This is the only book in the Bible that attributes the authorship of any of its texts to a woman or to women. I believe that the second part of Isaiah was written by a woman. I also believe it's at least plausible that a woman wrote Paul's letter to the Hebrews. But it's here that we have what I would say is incontrovertible truth, that the story was written by women. And if you go back, you'll recall what I and Nancy and others have said, and that is that you have 2 women of courage in this story who play central roles and who challenge patriarchal norms of the time. Then at the end, you have this reference to Esther and Mordecai writing the story. But But notice what I have here on screen. There's an arrow. In the artwork subsequent to the story, who's doing the writing? Mordecai, right? Mordecai is the one who's holding the quill while Esther looks on patiently. So you can see how patriarchal tradition is carried on both in the commentaries that would follow, again, regarding Mordecai as the real hero of the story, as well as Western artwork, where here Esther dutifully looks on as the man writes the story about what she and he did. So one of the things that I think is beneficiary for us is to pay closer attention to these details in the plot, which is not my strong suit sometimes, but I've spent a lot of time on this text. Pay attention to these details so that we can bring out what you might say is the lost story of Esther. A woman who exercises courage in the face of nearly impossible odds to save her people. Now, but wait, there's more. I did this for Kyle. I don't think he's here today, but there's more. There is something missing that we haven't covered so far, which is going to help explain next week why Esther was almost banned from the Bible. And so I want you to think about that something. Don't say it if you think you know it, but we'll come back to that next week. It's this particular something that really helps us understand why this book was on the periphery of the canon for centuries, and why, as well as the other reasons I cited, it wasn't or almost wasn't included in the Bible as we have it now. All right, so to summarize, we've used the 5 main parts of the story, to unpack Esther and make sense of the text. What are your questions, comments, or thoughts? That's probably the most talking I've ever done for a class at Queen Anne Lutheran. And I feel like I'm one of those, like I'm a little kid who wants to open up this toy chest and show you all the toys here. But it has really become a text that speaks to me in ways that I think a lot of the texts don't. And my hope is that it speaks to other men and women as providing examples, much needed examples for heroic activity on the part of women in the Bible. I will, let's see. Yeah, so are there questions or thoughts there? Jennifer says she's looking forward to next week. Okay, so I held on to you. That's good. I held on to your attention. That's good. What else? Other thoughts? Yeah, Nancy.
I'll ask a question. So I think this is an amazing story of these women who stood up in these ancient times when they had no rights of their own. And I'm sorry if I missed it, but did you say that's one of the reasons it wasn't well accepted as it went forward?
Not one of the explicit reasons, but I think it's certainly one of the reasons. Yeah, I mean, what happened is, again, that they call it Mordecai's story, and they call Mordecai the real hero of the story, and even the artwork portrays Mordecai as the one who wrote the story. So I think for those reasons, it was accepted. But this is what happens when it comes to some of these texts. Subsequent interpreters have to build up an interpretation, as it were, to preserve the text. So I would say that's one of the background reasons, but that it was covered enough by folks so that it was acceptable.
Yeah, so these two uppity women, we can't have this, right?
Right. Yeah.
We can't hold them up as
well
because they stood up to power.
Yeah, and I think one of the real benefits of feminist scholarship over the last, biblical scholarship in particular, over the last 30 or so years, has been to show that we have these characters in the Bible who have been overlooked because of patriarchal interpretation subsequently. So I think it's really important for us to do justice to these texts and go back with a more critical eye to uncover what's happening here. Yeah.
Thank
I
you.
must say, though, that it makes me wonder whether there isn't something else behind this about, judgment or something about these Jews who stayed in Persia rather than came back to Israel? And what is this symbolic language really talking about the Jewish people and what they were facing in this environment? I don't know. I mean, you find it really just about Esther and then Ishtar, and it's interesting to think about as well, and Marmaduke. But why would they add this story onto Ishtar and Marmaduke? Is there something about that root story that this elaborates and turns into something about the Jewish God and the Jewish people?
Yeah.
And,
well,
and
yeah,
why was it chosen by the Jews who wound up back in Israel, Judea, to be part of the canon when this was about those guys who just stayed in that awful place?
Yeah, that's a great question. And at this point, I don't know how to answer it, but it's not one I've considered before. But why was it the case that people in Jerusalem who were putting together and finalizing the canon in 100 AD, that they included this Persian text? My guess, especially given the fact that it was translated into Greek and then the additions that were included, was that the text by that time had become relatively widespread, that a lot of communities were reading it. We know that this is one of the factors when it comes to the choice of New Testament texts. That is, was the text being written by a large group of communities at the time? So my guess is, and this is just a guess, is that because of the Greek translation, the text was being widely read, and for that reason was ultimately included in the canon, but with the provision, among other things, that this was Mordecai's story, that Mordecai was the real hero, etc. That's my guess. The Song of Songs almost suffers a similar fate. The Song of Songs is the only example of erotic love poetry that we have in the Bible. And what's interesting, and this is what I was going to say a few moments ago, I forgot it, is that you can see the bias even in our lectionary. Our lectionary, which includes about 1/3 of the writings of Scripture, not once includes Esther. And I think that, pardon my French, I think that's such crap. That's French in pastor speak. I think that is such crap that we have a lectionary that is being used in moderate to progressive denominations that does not include the book of Esther. Not only that, but as far as I know, it doesn't include the Song of Songs. I've used the Song of Songs for weddings, but the Song of Songs, as scholars point out, is the only book in the Bible to praise erotic desire and to give us a glimpse of a non-coercive male-female relationship, period. And so because of that, it makes me wonder, are there hidden biases even in our own lectionary when it comes to the inclusion, or in these cases, exclusion of certain books? And it really upsets me. I think we have to do a lot better as a denomination if that's the case. And so what I would argue is that we maybe need to go back to the lectionary, or at the very least, local pastors like me need to start finding ways to incorporate Esther in our liturgies. So I don't care what Martin Luther said. I disagree with him on this one. Not on salvation, but on this one, I disagree. So, and I thank all of you. I hope you had a good time. I can't wait till next week. We're going to get to the biggest secret of all when it comes to the book of Esther. If not before, I'll see you then.